By the final years of her life, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was receiving a parliamentary annuity of £643,000 a year from the British taxpayer. That is what Parliament authorised. That is what the Consolidated Fund paid. Adjusted for inflation, it amounts to roughly £1.25 million in today's money, a sum designed to sustain a full royal household, fund public engagements, and maintain the dignity appropriate to the widow of a king. And yet, if you look closely at photographs from her later years, something doesn't square. Her teeth, visible in hundreds of public appearances across the 1990s, at Ascot and garden parties and regimental anniversaries, are noticeably discolored, some in visible disrepair. It's the kind of dental condition you associate with someone who hasn't received regular care, not someone drawing the equivalent of more than £1 million annually from the public purse. There is even a Quora thread, still live today, asking simply, why were the Queen Mother's teeth so brown? The explanation for that contradiction runs straight to the center of this story. Despite a substantial public income, she was a spender of almost heroic scale, consistently outrunning her means by a margin so large that her own daughter, the reigning sovereign, Queen Elizabeth II, eventually had to intervene using private resources to stop the situation becoming a public crisis. That intervention, according to UPI reporting from 2008, wasn't a single emergency measure. It was an arrangement. Elizabeth and Prince Charles had, in the wire service's careful phrasing, quietly helped her out. The Queen Mother died on the 30th of March, 2002, at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, aged 101. By the time of her death, UPI reported she owed approximately $14 million in total. A parliamentary income worth over £600,000 per year, and still the debts accumulated. Beneath the carefully curated image of the nation's beloved grandmother, the pastel coats, the gracious wave, the gin and Dubonnet, was a woman of extraordinary financial entitlement, whose reckless spending forced the sovereign to quietly subsidize her debts from private resources for half a century, to protect a reputation the palace couldn't afford to have publicly dismantled. That is the story. It starts during the war, when the image was built. On the 9th of September 1940, Buckingham Palace took a direct hit from a German bomb. The King and Queen were in residence. They weren't injured. The Queen's reported response to the bombing has circulated ever since. "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." It was exactly the right thing to say, in exactly the right tone, at exactly the right moment. The East End had been under bombardment for weeks. People were losing homes, losing family members, losing whole streets. And here was the Queen, bombed out in her own home, identifying with them rather than retreating from them. The newspapers ran the story. The image locked in. It wasn't accidental. The palace had understood from the beginning of the war that the King and Queen's response to the Blitz would be watched carefully, and that staying visible, remaining in London, remaining in danger alongside their subjects, was as much a strategic choice as a personal one. Government had suggested evacuating the royal family. The Queen's response was unambiguous. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the King, and the King will never leave." Norman Hartnell, her couturier, dressed her throughout this period in what he described as the rainbow of hope. Deliberately cheerful colors, never black, specifically chosen to project optimism rather than fear. What the Blitz period produced was something more durable than a wartime record. It produced a character. By the time the war ended in 1945, Elizabeth had become the nation's model matriarch. Stoic but warm, courageous but approachable, willing to suffer alongside her people. Adolf Hitler reportedly called her the most dangerous woman in Europe. Not for any military reason, but because her popularity made his propaganda about British decadence difficult to sustain. That designation, repeated in every subsequent account of her life, only gilded the image further. She was 45 when the war ended. She had more than 50 years left to live, and the image built in those wartime years would prove almost entirely self-sustaining. It required minimal maintenance and could absorb almost any inconvenient fact without leaving a visible mark. Gin helped. The stories about her fondness for gin and Dubonnet, a measure of gin, a measure of Dubonnet, ice and lemon, served before lunch, regularly and without apology, circulated for decades. They made her seem human rather than regal, approachable rather than remote. The book title eventually bestowed on her, "Do Let's Have Another Drink," captured the affectionate public understanding of a woman who enjoyed herself without pretension. The gin was charming. It was also, in retrospect, part of the mythology. It made the spending seem like the harmless indulgence of a spirited old lady, rather than what it actually was. George VI died on the 6th of February 1952 at Sandringham, Norfolk. He was 56 years old. The lung cancer diagnosed the previous autumn had progressed quickly. Princess Elizabeth, his elder daughter, was in Kenya at the time, 25 years old, and became Queen Elizabeth II in the moment of her father's death. She flew home to England. Her mother, now 51, adopted the title Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, specifically to avoid confusion with the new queen. From the 6th of February 1952, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, held no active constitutional role. She wasn't a regent. She held no governmental function, no executive authority. She carried out public engagements, generously and with evident enthusiasm, and she patronized approximately 350 organizations. But the actual constitutional infrastructure of a working queen was no longer hers to maintain. The sensible response to that change might have been consolidation. A principal London residence, perhaps one country home, a household appropriate to the scale of her actual duties. Instead, almost immediately, she began maintaining a portfolio of properties that would have been substantial even for an active sovereign. The royal household's own account records her moving from Buckingham Palace to Clarence House in 1952. Clarence House became her principal London residence for the remaining 50 years of her life, a Nash-designed building adjacent to St. James's Palace, first constructed between 1825 and 1827. Brian Hoey, in his book Not in Front of the Corgis, recorded that approximately 60 domestic staff were employed at Clarence House. 60 staff, at one property, servicing one person with no constitutional function. Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park she retained as a weekend retreat. The family had used it since 1931, and it was large enough to have its own staff, its own grounds, its own running costs. It was where she would eventually die in 2002. Birkhall was the third property, a modest 18th-century house on the Balmoral estate in Scotland, used during Highland summers. After the Queen Mother's death, it passed to Prince Charles and became his and Camilla's Scottish residence. It sits within the Balmoral estate, and, modest, at Balmoral, is still a considerable country house. And in 1952, she purchased Castle of May in Caithness, the extreme northeastern tip of the Scottish mainland, the most northerly castle in Britain. This was the only property she owned outright, purchased specifically because she wanted a private home of her own following her widowhood. She visited each August and October, which meant a full household needed to be operational for approximately 5 weeks per year, in a castle that had required extensive restoration after she acquired it. In 1996, she transferred it to a charitable trust, but for 44 years, she ran it as a personal residence. 4 properties, 1 person, no constitutional role. 60 domestic staff at the London house alone. The man theoretically responsible for ensuring the finances balanced across all of this was Major Sir Ralph Anstruther, who served as the Queen Mother's treasurer from 1961 until 1998. 37 years in the role. Those close to the household during this period described him in biographical accounts as having only a hazy idea of costs. 37 years as treasurer of one of Britain's most expensive private households, with only a hazy idea of costs. The result was inevitable. The parliamentary annuity of £643,000 per year placed the Queen Mother among the most generously funded members of the royal family outside the sovereign herself. Princess Margaret, who was an active working royal throughout much of the same period, carrying out official engagements, maintaining a public schedule, representing the Crown, received £219,000 per year, less than a third of her mother's allocation. And still, the £643,000 wasn't sufficient. Coutts, the private bank that has held royal accounts for generations, carried the evidence. Reports placing her Coutts overdraft at approximately £4 million emerged at and after her death. The Daily Express described it as such. The Telegraph, reporting on her finances in 2024, used the institutional hedging of, "She is said to have been overdrawn by £4 million in her account at Coutts." The language of, "it's said," signals something important. Widely reported, sourced to those who would know, consistent with everything else the record shows, but not publicly confirmed by the bank or the palace. What is in the public record is the Queen's remark about it. The Guardian, reporting on the day after her mother's death in 2002, included the line that had circulated privately for years. "Coutts would have folded long ago but for Mummy's overdraft." That line, from a woman not given to flippancy, deserves careful attention. It's the remark of someone who has known the figure for a long time, has processed the information to the point of resignation, and has arrived at the dry joke stage of acceptance. You don't reach the dry joke stage of acceptance quickly. It requires years of familiarity with a situation you can't change. The total picture at death was larger than any single Coutts figure. UPI, citing earlier coverage, reported in 2008 that by the time of her death, the Queen Mother owed approximately $14 million. The Daily Express placed the figure at over £7 million sterling. Various accounts range across this territory, and none of them rest on a published audit. The Queen Mother's private finances were private, but the shape of the story, large debts, accumulated over many years across a lifestyle that systematically outpaced income, is consistent across every credible account. One clarification is essential here. She wasn't technically insolvent. The royal household confirmed in 2002 that she bequeathed her entire estate, which mainly comprises the contents of her houses, to the Queen. 4 properties worth of contents, accumulated over a century, comprised substantial artworks, furniture, jewels, and personal collections. By some estimates, her net estate ran to between £50 and £70 million in assets. The picture isn't of a pauper, but of a person who maintained simultaneous liabilities and assets, consistently spent money she didn't have, and left both the valuables and the bills to her daughter. The bailout, as far as the available evidence allows us to trace it, wasn't a single crisis intervention. It was a recurring, practical arrangement. UPI stated plainly in 2008 that Elizabeth II, then Prince Charles, had quietly helped her out during her lifetime. The verb quietly is doing significant work in that sentence. This wasn't a published subsidy. It wasn't an additional parliamentary annuity. It was private, discreet, and sustained across decades. The Queen's private income has a specific structure worth understanding. The Duchy of Lancaster, a hereditary crown estate, generates income that accrues directly to the sovereign, bypassing the treasury. Unlike the crown estate, whose annual profits flow to the government, duchy income belongs to the monarch personally and is at the sovereign's discretion. In Elizabeth II's reign, duchy income ran to several millions of pounds per year. It's the mechanism most commonly invoked when royal biographers refer to the Queen's private financial resources. Balmoral and Sandringham represent something more straightforward: genuinely privately owned estates, inherited from her father, whose revenues fed into the royal family's personal portfolio. These, combined with duchy income, constituted what Elizabeth II could direct without reference to Parliament or Treasury. Where exactly the support for the Queen Mother originated within this structure isn't documented in any public record. The exact mechanism, duchy income, estate revenues, some other private account, remains in the private ledgers that the palace has never opened. What is known is that it came from somewhere private, that it was ongoing, and that it covered a gap a £643,000 annual income couldn't close. The duration of the arrangement is what transforms a financial anecdote into a structural fact. The Queen Mother was widowed in February 1952 and died in March 2002, exactly 50 years. Throughout that period, she consistently overspent her income. UPI described her as having done so throughout her lifetime. The bailout, as documented, wasn't a crisis response to a single emergency in her final years. It was the product of a long-established pattern, managed quietly, never discussed publicly, never acknowledged by the woman benefiting from it. One element adds further texture. The Queen Mother's passion for horse racing wasn't a casual hobby. She was a serious owner of steeplechasers throughout her widowhood, with horses in active training, entrance fees, trainers' bills, veterinary costs, and the attendant losses of a sport where horses finish out of the money rather more often than they win. These were real, recurring costs, and they weren't absorbed by a fixed income that was already insufficient to cover the household alone. The Queen Mother never, in any documented account, acknowledged the financial burden she placed on her daughter. She never adjusted her spending in response to it. She never, as far as the available record shows, expressed any awareness that the situation was either problematic or unfair, or that the person absorbing the costs deserved acknowledgement. This is perhaps the most revealing fact in the entire story, not the debts themselves, but the silence around them. The debts weren't the result of misfortune or emergency. They were the result of a sustained choice to live at a scale her income couldn't support, on the assumption that the gap would always be covered. And it always was. So the assumption held, year after year, until she died. William Shawcross, appointed official biographer with full access to her personal letters and diaries, published his 1,100-page account in 2009. The Guardian's reviewer noted the slightly glazed quality of its second half, encapsulated in Shawcross's own phrase that in the latter decades of her life, one decade glided into another. The horses, the garden parties, the gin, the Clarence House entertainments, the castle visits, the public appearances, round and round, funded by an income that never covered them. The biography does not address the debts or the bailout mechanism directly. That is the prerogative of an authorized biography, and the silence on the subject is, in its quiet way, informative. The critical press was no different, at least not while she was alive. Coverage of the Queen Mother through most of the 1970s and 1980s was studiously uncritical. The palace's communications operation understood that her image was an institutional asset worth protecting, and the public affection for her was deep enough to make sustained scrutiny difficult. The mainstream consensus was warm biography and fond remembrance. What the image management was protecting, throughout those decades, was the distance between the public account and the private one. The Blitz, the staying in London, the pastel coats and the gin and the races and the wave from the carriage. That record was genuine, or genuine enough in its emotional register to sustain a national myth. What was also true, and carefully kept from becoming part of the public understanding of her, was that behind the palace doors, the debts were growing, and her daughter was paying. Elizabeth II was, by every biographical account, the precise opposite of her mother in financial temperament. Personally frugal, by the standards of her position, constitutionally meticulous, deeply committed to the idea that the monarchy's credibility depended on propriety and discretion. She had watched the damage done to the crown by Edward VIII's abdication, had spent her entire reign ensuring nothing comparable would occur under her watch. And yet for 50 years, she quietly underwrote a woman who was, in financial terms, the antithesis of everything she stood for. The Coutts remark is evidence of a sharpness she rarely showed in public. Coutts would have folded long ago but for Mummy's overdraft, is what you say when you have been carrying something for a very long time, and in the immediate aftermath of loss, you allow yourself one dry line about the weight of it. It's also, notably, the only public crack in 50 years of silence. No complaint, no suggestion that the arrangement was burdensome, no reference in any documented interview or public appearance to the financial relationship between the two women. Just the quiet mechanism of private support, maintained for half a century, and one joke at the end. The Queen Mother died at Royal Lodge on the 30th of March 2002 at 3:15 in the afternoon. She had outlived her husband by exactly 50 years. Her estate, as confirmed by the royal household, passed in its entirety to the Queen. The debts, whatever their final sum, were absorbed. Prince Charles inherited Birkhall. The other properties were redistributed or disposed of in due course. The Coutts account, reportedly £4 million in overdraft, was settled privately, as everything had always been settled privately. There is something in the simple arithmetic of this story that deserves to be stated plainly before the end. The parliamentary annuity of £643,000 per year represented a genuine public commitment. Parliament had authorised it. The Consolidated Fund paid it. British taxpayers funded it, decade after decade. In today's money, it runs to over £1 million annually. It was intended to fund a royal household commensurate with the dignity of the widow of a king. And it wasn't enough. Not because she was in genuine hardship, but because she was spending at a rate no fixed income, however generous, could sustain. 4 residences, 60 domestic staff at one property alone, servicing a woman who had held no constitutional function since 1952. A treasurer with a hazy idea of costs. A horse racing operation that generated recurring losses, entertaining at the scale of a working court, sustained long after the working court had ceased to exist. At the other end of the equation, a daughter who received no acknowledgement, who asked for none, and who paid, year after year, for 50 years. Not because any formal obligation required it, because the alternative, a public financial crisis involving the most beloved woman in Britain, wasn't something the Crown could absorb. So she paid. And she made a joke about Coutts. And the image held. The pastels and the wave. The gin and the horses. The Blitz and the staying and the East End. That is what the country saw, and what the country was shown for 6 decades. Behind the palace doors, the Coutts account stood reportedly £4 million overdrawn. Total debts at death reached an estimated $14 million, and the woman who ultimately bore those obligations was the one person in the country who couldn't publicly make an issue of it, the sovereign herself, whose constitutional duty included protecting the very reputation her mother's spending threatened. For 50 years, from the 6th of February 1952 to the 30th of March 2002, Queen Elizabeth II quietly underwrote the most beloved woman in Britain. Not because the accounts were ever balanced, not because the arrangement was ever acknowledged, but because the myth was worth more to the institution than the money. She was the grandmother of the nation, smiling in her pastels, and her daughter spent half a century quietly writing the checks to keep the myth alive. Subscribe for more stories like this.